Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, June 6th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Milley says that Ukraine is well prepared for a counteroffensive. So this was on Monday. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said that Ukraine was well prepared to launch a counteroffensive against Russia thanks to support from the US and NATO. Milley said, quote, I think it's too early to tell what outcomes are going to happen. I think the Ukrainians are very well prepared, as you know very well. The United States and other allied countries in Europe and really around the world have provided training and ammunition and advice, intelligence, etc., to the Ukrainians, end quote. This really goes to show, as it does look like Ukraine has started some sort of offensive, how their war effort is entirely reliant on this support from the US and NATO. Shows how involved the US is in the war. He said that they've provided training, ammunition, advice, intelligence, etc. I'd like to know what he means by etc. But we also know, of course, weapons and all of that type of support. Milley's comments came a day after Russia said that Ukraine launched a large scale offensive in Donetsk. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that they thwarted the offensive and inflicted heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians later on Monday, they denied Russia's claims, but then the deputy Ukrainian defense minister said that Kiev was shifting toward offensive actions in some areas. And U.S. officials told the New York Times that the counteroffensive has likely started, citing satellite data. Several more Ukrainian attacks were reported in the Donbass region on Monday. Prigozhin, the head of the Russian Wagner group, his forces pulled out of Bakhmut, but he said on Monday that Ukrainian forces made gains on the outskirts of Bakhmut. And Denis Pushilin, who's the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, he said that the situation outside of Bakhmut was under control, but very difficult. So it sounded like there was some fighting there. So if you're watching the video here, you see this is a map of the Donbass from South Front. They do daily battlefield updates, and they seem to be pretty accurate. I've been checking them throughout this whole war, and they're usually right. And they were the first place I saw that Ukraine gained territory in Kharkiv last year. They had it before any Western media outlets did. So, I always check them, and we can use their maps, which is nice. But if you look at this, you could see that these are the battle lines, and there's a lot of action here. There's a lot of Ukrainian attacks, including near Bakhmut, and they did report that Ukrainian forces did enter this village to the northwest of Bakhmut. So I think that's what Prigozhin is talking about. But it looks like a lot of fighting is going on, and that this seems to be the counteroffensive. We don't know for sure if this is really the big thing or what exactly is happening here, but it'll be clear, I think, in the coming days. So you have Milley, assuring that Ukraine's in good shape. But as we know, as I've covered quite a bit, the Discord leaks and a lot of media reports have indicated that the U.S. does not think that Ukraine can really regain much territory. And we know from Blinken's recent speech that it doesn't matter. They're not going to push for diplomacy at all. The U.S. is not going to push for diplomacy at all. And they're ready to just keep building up Ukraine's military and pouring weapons into the country, no matter how long this war is going to last. All right, the next one here. Belgium asks Ukraine if Belgian rifles were used in attacks on Russia. So this is a response to that Washington Post report that I went over yesterday. Belgium's Prime Minister Alexander De Croo, he said Monday that his government is asking Ukraine if Belgian rifles were used by pro-Kiev fighters in a recent attack on Russia's Belgorod region. So that Washington Post report said that the Russian volunteers that were have been attacking Ukraine were armed with US made armored vehicles and rifles that were made in Belgium and the Czech Republic during a raid on Belgorod. And that was specifically about the first attack that they announced on May 22nd. And there's been a lot of attacks since then. I think even right now, there's still fighting going on in Belgorod. So Decroux said, quote, "Our defense ministry and its intelligence agencies have started an investigation and are asking for information to determine what has happened exactly. European weapons are delivered to Ukraine under the condition that they are used on Ukrainian territory with the purpose of defending that territory, and we have strict controls in place to see that this is the case," end quote. So he kind of hinted that, Belgium might take some sort of action if it turns out Ukraine did use them in Russia, but I'm not sure really what they could do. And these two groups that have taken credit for these Belgrade attacks, the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, they've both admitted to using NATO weapons. And we know the Russian Volunteer Corps is made up of neo Nazis. So you have neo Nazis using U.S. and NATO equipment to attack Russian territory. It's just amazing. This is like everything we've always warned about of what this proxy war could lead to. It's all kind of culminating, and who knows what the next big escalation in this conflict is going to be. So at least Belgium seems to be a little concerned. The U.S. has still not, that Washington Post report I went over, it was U.S. officials speaking to the Washington Post, but speaking on the condition of anonymity. I haven't seen yet the White House or the State Department admit that American weapons were used in this attack on Russia, because now it's very clear that they were. All right, the next one here: Ukraine will not attend NATO summit if there's no signal toward membership. So Zelensky told this to the Wall Street Journal in an interview that was published Saturday. He said that his country will sit out of the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius this July if Kiev is not given a signal toward full membership in the alliance. So Zelensky said that he does not expect Ukraine to be granted membership while fighting is ongoing, but he wants a pledge that the country will be admitted after the war. When asked if he expected to get the signal that he wanted, Zelensky said he doesn't know. So he's not sure if he's going to get what he wants, but he's threatening to sit out the NATO summit. And I'm sure, for symbolism's sake, that's not something that, Stoltenberg and, the NATO, the leadership in NATO wants. So Ukraine was first promised their eventual NATO membership back in 2008, but they've never really been given a timeline. And I've been covering this a lot lately, so I don't want to get too into it. But basically what's happening is Ukraine's backers in NATO, they're sort of debating what guarantees they're going to give Ukraine at this Vilnius summit. It could be a pretty pivotal summit. 2008 was the Bucharest summit in Romania when they made this promise to Ukraine, that despite the warnings at the time from William Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, that Ukrainian entry into NATO was the brightest of all red lines for Moscow. They knew that it would be very provocative toward Russia. And we know that new guarantees are just going to prolong the war, because Ukrainian neutrality is Russia's main war goal. So, whatever they promise Ukraine, it's not going to be good for the prospect of ending this war. All right. So the next one here, this is from the Gray Zone, from Alexander Rubinstein, the father of American jailed in Ukraine, speaks out. So this is the father of Gonzalo Lira. He is, I covered his story last week. He was arrested by Ukraine's SBU. He's an American and Chilean citizen who's been critical of Ukraine, and he's been arrested on allegations that he justified the Russian invasion. So basically, for his speech, they're not trying to hide it. Using these new laws that they passed, it's part of Zelensky's crackdown on dissent, that they're able to try to convict people with a law like this. So the Gray Zone spoke with his father, and he's basically just speaking out. He's very worried about his son. He says he's having trouble sleeping, knowing that he's been arrested. A very sad story. And he spoke to it doesn't seem like he's gotten any help or any signal from the US government. He spoke to the US Embassy in Kiev. They held a video conference with Lira on around May 23rd, I guess he was told by the US Embassy in Kiev. He initiated contact with the embassy to ask them to work towards his son's release. He was told only that his son has been provided a defense attorney by Ukrainian authorities. So I think it doesn't look like the U.S. government is looking to secure his release or helping his father out. So I might try to follow up on this with the State Department, see what they have to say. See if they've been in contact with his father. I think it's been a couple weeks now since Liam, sorry, not Liam, Cosgrove, the reporter for the Epoch Times, who asked the State Department about Lira. When he asked them, the State Department refused to comment. That was about a week and a half ago. So maybe I could ask them again, kind of word it differently, and see if I can get any information out of them. All right, the next one here. The New York Times acknowledges the Nazi problem in Ukraine. So we just linked to this story that was published in the New York Times on Monday about the Nazi, symbols and icons that Ukrainian soldiers often are wearing. You see a lot of pictures. Sometimes there's pictures of Ukrainian soldiers posted by NATO when they have Nazi symbols. Usually the black sun, and then this skull and crossbones that's known as Nazi symbols. So this is something that everybody that knew anything about Ukraine before the invasion knew, that there was sort of this far right neo-Nazi element within Ukraine's armed forces and in Ukraine's political landscape. And of course, that hasn't been covered much in the mainstream media since the invasion. And if you see the way the New York Times, this isn't the best article, but I wanted to just link to it so people could see what the New York Times is, how they're covering this. It's interesting. Basically, they're saying that it's not a problem that they're using Nazi symbols and stuff. The problem is that this could feed into, Russian propaganda, is how they put it. If you look at the subtitle here, troops' use of patches bearing Nazi emblems risks fueling Russian propaganda and spreading imagery that the West has spent half a century trying to eliminate. So that's kind of the gist of it, saying that Western journalists are in a conundrum because if they report on the Nazi icons and things, then they might be justifying or playing into Russian propaganda. So it does go to show, how the propaganda machine worked in the West, how they ignored, for the most part, ignored this stuff for over a year now. Even though there's plenty of coverage, again, about it in the Western media before the invasion, and there's been some kind of whitewashing of like the Azov Battalion, which is the more one of the more well-known neo-Nazi groups that was absorbed into Ukraine's armed forces. And they try to act like, it's different now, but I don't think, wars tend to, create more extremists. It usually doesn't, root them out. Okay, so the next one here, this is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. Netanyahu threatens Iran, slams the IAEA. So Netanyahu and Israel are really not happy that the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, they've been cooperating with Iran and they've been making progress. And of course, Israel's not happy. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ramped up his threats of war against Iran and slammed the International Atomic Energy Agency for cooperating with Tehran on Sunday. Netanyahu's threats were included as part of a video statement recorded from Tel Aviv's underground command bunker at Israel's military headquarters, where a rare cabinet war drill was convened. The Israeli leader emphasized his willingness to launch a preemptive war, including bombing the country's nuclear facilities if international diplomacy fails with Iran. He said, quote, "We are committed to acting against Iran's nuclear drive, against missile attacks on Israel, and the possibility of these fronts joining up," end quote. And Connor mentions that this comes after Israel just did a 2-week series of military exercises where they said they were preparing for war on multiple fronts. And it really goes after, Netanyahu really, again, goes after the IAEA, accusing them of falling for Iranian propaganda, I guess. This is how he put it. He said, quote, Iran is continuing to lie to the International Atomic Energy Agency. The agency's capitulation to Iranian pressure is a black stain on its record, end quote. And Connor mentions the very crucial context here that it's really something that the Israelis constantly criticize Iran and the IAEA for the way they inspect their nuclear facilities. When Israel has a secret nuclear weapons program, they're not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Their nuclear weapons program, it's not a civilian nuclear program like Iran's. Is subject. Israel's program is subject to no inspections. They don't declare how many warheads they have. We really don't know how many warheads they do have. It's estimated to be a few hundred. And they go on these rants about Iran. It's really just amazing hypocrisy. All right, the next one here. This is a pretty sad story. Palestinian toddler shot by Israeli soldiers dies from wounds. This article is from the Middle East Eye. So a 2-year-old Palestinian boy who was shot in the head by Israeli soldiers died from his wounds on Monday. Muhammad Tamimi and his father Haitham Tamimi were hit by Israeli fire near Ramallah in the occupied West Bank on Thursday. The pair were in their parked car outside of their home when they were targeted, according to eyewitnesses. Haitham, his father, was shot in the chest and taken to a hospital in Ramallah, while Muhammad was seriously wounded in the head and evacuated to an Israeli hospital where he remained on life support until he was pronounced dead this morning. The Israeli military admitted to shooting the toddler and his father, saying that they mistook him for Palestinian fighters. The army was claiming that they were returning fire at a group of Palestinian fighters who allegedly targeted a settlement nearby. However, a family, relative, and local activist told Middle East Eye that Muhammad and Haitham were in a car and about to drive away. As soon as the car moved, Israeli soldiers shot at them. So really tragic story here. And, there's been a lot of violence against Palestinians this year. Israeli forces and settlers have killed at least 119 Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem this year, and a further 34 in the Gaza Strip. At least 25 children have been killed overall in this violence. So that's what our tax dollars are funding when, we give Israel $3.8 billion in military aid each year. And after they did a pretty serious bombing campaign in Gaza in 2021, they got an extra $1 billion as a reward. They killed about 60 children in that bombing campaign. All right, the next one here, this is another one from the Libertarian Institute. This is from Kyle Anzalone. Blinken says that the U.S. will strengthen ties with Israel and promote Saudi-Israeli normalization. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he delivered a speech to AIPAC, the lobby group, and was basically saying that Washington, just reaffirming the Biden administration's ironclad support for Israel, again, even amidst all this violence. And he said that part of the White House's plans to strengthen Israel's security would be to push Saudi Arabia into a normalization agreement with Israel. So, this is something that there's a lot of signs here that the Biden administration is really pushing for this Israel-Saudi normalization. But I don't know if it's going to happen. You have the Saudis and Iran making nice. They normalize. They're trying to forge ties. Iran saying that they want to build a naval alliance with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf states. That really goes against the U.S. and Israel's plans, because these normalization deals, the idea was to build this anti-Iran coalition. So I think, it's not really going as planned, but they're still pushing for it. And during his speech, Blinken was, touting U.S. support for Israel, which I mentioned the $3.8 billion in military aid each year. That's $3.3 billion in foreign military financing, and that's the State Department program. They give them money to buy U.S. weapons. And then on top of that, Israel receives $500 million in funding for its missile defense. So, they used to be the top recipients of U.S. military aid until this past year when Ukraine obviously became the top recipient. Um, all right. So the next one here, the U.S. accuses China of aggressiveness in the Taiwan Strait. What are those Chinese ships doing near China? So the White House on Monday accused the Chinese military of being more aggressive in waters near China's coast, following two encounters between the U.S. and Chinese militaries in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. So, in recent years, the U.S. has been increasing its military presence in the region as part of a military buildup that is explicitly aimed at preparing for a future war with China. That's what U.S. military officials say that they're doing. Beijing has been warning against the U.S. buildup, and now they appear to be taking more action in an attempt to deter U.S. flights and naval patrols. On Saturday, just to go over, the U.S. said that a Chinese warship passed within 150 yards in front of a U.S. naval ship that was transiting the Taiwan Strait with a Canadian vessel. And then a few days earlier, the U.S. accused the Chinese aircraft of conducting an unprofessional intercept of a surveillance plane over the South China Sea. So this is White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. He said, quote, "Sadly, this is just part of a growing aggressiveness by the PRC that we're dealing with, and we're prepared to address it. It won't be long before somebody gets hurt," end quote. So I don't know what he means by they're prepared to address it. I have a feeling that the U.S. is going to respond to this by just increasing everything, the flights, the patrols. Austin said at the Shangri-La dialogue that the U.S. is going to continue flying and sailing in these waters. So also on Monday over in Beijing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin defended the Chinese military actions when asked about the incident in the Taiwan Strait. He said, quote, "The actions taken by the Chinese military are necessary steps in response to the provocations by the country concerned. These actions are completely justified, lawful, safe, and professional. China resolutely opposes the country concerned stirring up trouble in the Taiwan Strait and is firmly determined to defend its sovereignty and security and regional peace and stability," end quote. So China's defense minister, he also defended the actions during the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. So this is the situation. Who knows exactly how the U.S. is going to respond? But, this U.S. military presence in the region, it really heightens the risk of an accident between the two militaries, especially now that China seems to be reacting more to these flights and patrols. And, back in 2001, the Hainan Island incident occurred, and that was when a U.S. spy plane collided with a Chinese jet over the South China Sea, and it killed the Chinese pilot. The American pilot landed in Hainan Island, and U.S.-China relations were at a better point. It really whipped up some anti-American sentiment in China, and something like that. If something like that happens now, I can't imagine it being settled as quickly as it was back in 2001. I mean, it could really spiral into something. And I think, you have the U.S. planning to start doing joint patrols with the Philippines, joint Coast Guard patrols. They're stepping up these surveillance flights, Taiwan Strait transits, just so many areas where some sort of accident can happen. And if something does, it's just really, really not going to be good. But of course, the Chinese, are the aggressive ones, even though this is all happening over, right near China's coast. All right. So the next one here, France objects to NATO opening an office in Japan. So French President Emmanuel Macron objects to NATO's plans to open a liaison office in Japan and thinks that the alliance should stay in the North Atlantic. And this is according to a report from the Financial Times. NATO's push to open its first office in the Asia Pacific is part of the U.S.'s plans to get its Western allies more involved in its strategy against China in the region. NATO's plans to open a Japan office were first reported by Nikkei Asia in early May, and they drew a rebuke from Beijing. People familiar with the matter told Financial Times that France's objection has complicated NATO talks on the Japan office, which have been ongoing for months. A French official said that Paris believes the NATO charter limits the alliance's geographic range to the North Atlantic. Macron has said publicly that he does not think NATO should expand beyond the North Atlantic. He said this last week at some event. He said, quote, "If we push NATO to enlarge the spectrum and the geography, we will make a big mistake," end quote. So all 31 NATO members need to agree to open a new liaison office, meaning that France could potentially block the move. News of France's position comes nearly 2 months after Macron said that Europe should not follow the US into a conflict with China over Taiwan. And that he angered a lot of hawks in the US when he said that. NATO has had its eyes on China for a few years now. It was in 2020 when they started, identifying China as a threat somehow to the North Atlantic Alliance. And Beijing has repeatedly warned the alliance to stay out of the region. So I think it's good to see, more signs that France and other European countries aren't going to, blindly follow the U.S. into Asia. Although France has sent warships and stuff into the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea in recent years. Not nearly as often as the U.S. does, though, of course. But that's everything for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from M. Reza Benam, deconstructing Israel's propaganda machine. One from Ted Snyder, a plea not to risk nuclear war. One from Carrie Wedler over at FEE, best way to honor fallen soldiers is to stop sending troops to war. One from Bradley Devlin, don't ask, don't tell in Ukraine. One from Ben Freeman, how weapons firms influence the Ukraine debate. This is over at Responsible Statecraft, just about how, all these think tanks funded by the arms makers are, just flooding the media. That's where so much information in the Western media comes from, is these people that benefit directly from, more arms being sold and more arms being poured into Ukraine and all that. So definitely go check that out. That's it. We have our picture story is about a U.S. senator demanding a report on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist who was killed by Israeli forces last year. And this senator is, who is it? Van Hollen. Is that his name? Sorry, is that the senator's name? I think it is. Yeah, Van Hollen. He said during a Senate budget hearing on Wednesday. So I'm not sure. I don't know much about him, but it's good to see at least somebody is caring about that. But that's everything for today. Please help us out. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Share this show around. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe to this on YouTube. All that stuff helps in the comments and everything. But that's it. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.